Content of this program is intended for people who are blind and or print impaired. Hi everybody. Welcome to the New Yorker Hour on the Triangle Radio Reading Service. I'm Evan Mercer, and today I'll be reading from the archives of the New Yorker magazine. Today we'll be focusing on an American author, David Foster Wallace, who took his life at the young age of 46 in 2009. First, I'll read a short story by him, followed by an essay about his life and writings. First, the short story. It's entitled Good People: Two Young Christians and an Unwanted Pregnancy, by David Foster Wallace, published in the February 5th, 2007 edition of the New Yorker magazine. They were up on a picnic table at that park by the lake, by the edge of the lake, with part of a downed tree in the shallows half hidden by the bank. Lane A. Dean, Jr., and his girlfriend, both in blue jeans and button-up shirts. They sat up on the table's top portion and had their shoes on the bench part that people sat on to picnic or fellowship together in carefree times. They'd gone to different high schools, but the same junior college, where they had met in campus ministries. It was springtime, and the park's grass was very green, and the air suffused with honeysuckle and lilacs, both, which was almost too much. There were bees, and the angle of the sun made the water of the shallows look dark. There had been more storms that week, with some downed trees and the sound of chainsaws all up and down his parents' street. Their postures on the picnic table were both the same, forward kind, with their shoulders rounded and elbows on their knees. In this position, the girl rocked slightly and once put her face in her hands, but she was not crying. Lane was very still and immobile, and looking past the bank at the downed tree in the shallows and its ball of exposed roots going all directions, and the tree's cloud of branches all half in the water. The only other individual nearby was a dozen spaced tables away, by himself, standing upright, looking at the torn-up hole in the ground there where the tree had gone over. It was still early yet, and all the shadows wheeling right and shortening. The girl wore a thin old checked cotton shirt with pearl-colored snaps, with the long sleeves down, and always smelled very good and clean, like someone you could trust and care about, even if you weren't in love. Lane Dean had liked the smell of her right away. His mother called her down to earth and liked her. Thought she was good people. You could tell. She made this evident in little ways. The shallows lapped from different directions at the tree as if almost teething on it. Sometimes when alone and thinking or struggling to turn a matter over to Jesus Christ in prayer, he would find himself putting his fist in his palm and turning it slightly, as if still playing and pounding his glove to stay sharp and alert and center. He did not do this now. It would be cruel and indecent to do this now. The older individual stood beside his picnic table. He was at it, but not sitting, and looked also out of place in a suit coat or jacket, and the kind of men's hat Lane's grandfather wore in photos as a young insuranceman. He appeared to be looking across the lake. If he moved, Lane didn't see it. He looked more like a picture than a man. There were not any ducks in view. One thing Lane did was reassure her again that he'd go with her and be there with her. It was one of the few safe or decent things he could really say. The second time he said it again, now she shook her head and laughed in an unhappy way that was more just air out of her nose. Her real laugh was different. Where he'd be was the waiting room, she said. That he'd be thinking about her and feeling bad for her, she knew, but he couldn't be in there with her. This was so obviously true that he felt like a ninny, and that he'd kept on about it and now knew what she had thought every time he went and said it. It hadn't brought her comfort or eased the burden at all. The worse he felt, the stiller he sat. The whole thing felt balanced on a knife or wire. If he moved to put his arm up or touch her, the whole thing could tip over. He hated himself for sitting so frozen. He could almost visualize himself tiptoeing past something explosive, a big, stupid-looking tiptoe like in a cartoon. The whole last black week had been this way, and it was wrong. He knew it was wrong, knew something was required of him that was not this terrible frozen care and caution, but he pretended to himself he did not know what it was that was required. He pretended it had no name. He pretended that not saying aloud what he knew to be right and true was for her sake, was for the sake of her needs and feelings. He also worked dock and routing at UPS on top of school, but had traded to get the day off after they decided together. 2 days before, he had awakened very early and tried to pray, but could not. He was freezing more and more solid, he felt like, but he had not thought of his father or the blank frozenness of his father, even in church, which had once filled him with such pity. This was the truth. Lane Dean Jr. felt sun on one arm as he pictured in his mind an image of himself on a train, waving mechanically to something that got smaller and smaller as the train pulled away. His father and his mother's father had the same birthday, a cancer. Sherry's hair was colored and almost corn blonde, very clean, the skin through her central part pink in the sunlight. They'd sat here long enough that only their right side was shaded now. He could look at her head, but not at her. Different parts of him felt unconnected to each other. She was smarter than him, and they both knew it. It wasn't just school. Lane Dean was in accounting and business and did all right. He was hanging in there. She was a year older, 20, but it was also more. She had always seemed to Lane to be on good terms with her life in a way that age could not account for. His mother had put it that she knew what it is she wanted, which was nursing, and not an easy program at Peoria Junior College. And plus, she worked hostessing at the Embers and had bought her own car. She was serious in a way Lane liked. She had a cousin that died when she was 13, 14, that she'd loved and been close with. She only talked about it that once. He liked her smell and her downy arms and the way she exclaimed when something made her laugh. He had liked just being with her and talking to her. She was serious in her faith and values in a way that Lane had liked, and now, sitting here with her on the table, found himself afraid of. This was an awful thing. He was starting to believe that he might not be serious in his faith. He might be somewhat of a hypocrite, like the Assyrians in Isaiah, which would be a far graver sin than the appointment. He had decided he believed this. He was desperate to be good people, to still be able to feel he was good. He rarely before now had thought of damnation and hell. That part of it didn't speak to his spirit. And in worship services, he more just tuned himself out and tolerated hell when it came up. The same way you tolerate the job you've got to have to save up for what it is you want. Her tennis shoes had little things doodled on them from sitting in her class lectures. She stayed looking down like that. Little notes or reading assignments in thick in her neat round hand on the rubber elements around the sneaker's rim. Lane A. Dean, looking now at her inclined head sides, barrettes in the shape of blue ladybugs. The appointment was for afternoon, but when the doorbell had rung so early and his mother called to him up the stairs, he had known, and a terrible kind of blankness had commenced falling through him. He told her that he did not know what to do, that he knew if he was the salesman of it and forced it upon her, that was awful and wrong. But he was trying to understand. They'd prayed on it and talked it through from every different angle. Lane said how sorry she knew he was, and that if he was wrong in believing they'd truly decided together when they decided to make the appointment, she should please tell him, because He thought he knew how she must have felt as it got closer and closer, and how she must be so scared. But that what he couldn't tell her was if it was more than that. But that what he couldn't tell was if it was more than that. He was totally still, except for moving his mouth, it felt like. She did not reply. That if they needed to pray on it more and talk it through, then he was here, he was ready, he said. The appointment could get moved back. If she just said the word, they could call and push it back to take some more time to be sure in the decision. It was still so early in it. They both knew that, he said. This was true, that he felt this way, and yet he also knew he was also trying to say things that would get her to open up, and say enough back that he could see her and read her heart and know what to say to get her to go through with it. He knew this without admitting to himself that this was what he wanted, for it would make him a hypocrite and a liar. He knew in some locked up little part of him why it was that he'd gone to no one to open up and seek their life counsel. Not Pastor Steve or the prayer partners at Campus Ministries, not his UPS friends or the spiritual counseling available through his parents' old church. But he did not know why Sherry herself had not gone to Pastor Steve. He could not read her heart. She was blank and hidden. He so fervently wished it never happened. He felt like he knew now why it was a true sin and not just a leftover rule from past society. He felt like he had been brought low by it and humbled, and now did believe that the rules were there for a reason, that the rules were concerned with him personally as an individual. He promised God he had learned his lesson. But what if that, too, was a hollow promise from a hypocrite who repented only after, who promised submission but only really wanted a reprieve? He might not even know his own heart or be able to read and know himself. He kept thinking also of 1 Timothy and the hypocrite therein who disputeth over words. He felt a terrible inner resistance, but could not feel what it was that it resisted. This was the truth. All the different angles and ways they had come at the decision together did not ever include it, the word. For had he once said it, avowed that he did love her, loved Sherry Fisher, then it all would have been transformed. It would not be a different stance or angle, but a difference in the very thing they were praying and deciding on together. Sometimes they had prayed together over the phone in a kind of half code in case anybody accidentally picked up the extension. She continued to sit as if thinking, in the pose of thinking, like one statue. They were right up next to each other on the table. He was looking over past her at the tree in the water, but he could not say he did. It was not true. But neither did he ever open up and tell her straight out he did not love her. This might be his lie by omission. This might be the frozen resistance. Were he to look right at her and tell her he didn't, she would keep the appointment and go. He knew this. Something in him, though, some terrible weakness or lack of values, could not tell her. It felt like a muscle he did not have. He didn't know why, he just could not do it, or even pray to do it. She believed he was good, serious in his values. Part of him seemed willing to more or less just about lie to someone with that kind of faith and trust, and what did that make him? How could such a type of individual even pray? What it really felt like was a taste of the reality of what might be meant by hell. Lane Dean had never believed in hell as a lake of fire or a loving God consigning folks to a burning lake of fire. He knew in his heart that this was not true. What he believed in was a living God of compassion and love and the possibility of a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, through whom this love was enacted in human time. But sitting here beside this girl, as unknown to him now as outer space, waiting for whatever she might say to unfreeze him. Now he felt like he could see the edge or outline of what a real vision of hell might be. It was of two great and terrible armies within himself, opposed and facing each other silent. There would be battle, but no victor. Or never a battle. The armies would stay like that, motionless, looking across at each other and seeing therein something so different and alien from themselves that they could not understand, could not hear each other's speech as even words or read anything from what their face looked like, frozen like that, opposed and uncomprehending for all human time. Two-hearted, a hypocrite to yourself either way. When he moved his head, a part of the lake further outflashed with sun. The water up close wasn't black now, and you could see into the shallows and see that all the water was moving, but gently, this way and that. And in the same way he besought to return to himself as Sherry moved her leg and started to turn beside him. He could see the man in the suit and gray hat standing motionless now at the lake's rim, holding something under one arm and looking across at the opposite side, where a row of little forms on camp chairs sat in a way that meant they had lines in the water for crappie, which mostly only your blacks from the east side ever did, and the little white shape at the row's end, a styrofoam creel. In his moment or time at the lake now just to come, Lane Dean first felt he could take this all in whole. Everything seemed distinctly lit, for the circle of the pin oak shade had rotated off all the way, and they sat now in sun with their shadow a two-headed thing in the grass before them. He was looking or gazing again at where the downed trees' branches seemed to all bend so sharply just under the shallow surface, when he was given to know that through all this frozen silence he despised he had, in truth, been praying, or some little part of his heart he could not hear had. For he was answered now with a type of vision, what he would later call within his own mind a vision or moment of grace. He was not a hypocrite, just broken and split off like all men. Later on, he believed that what happened was he'd had a moment of almost seeing them both as Jesus saw them, as blind but groping, wanting to please God despite their inborn fallen nature. For in that same given moment he saw quick as light into Sherry's heart and was made to know what would occur here as she finished turning to him, and the man in the hat watched the fishing, and the downed elm shed cells into the water. This down-to-earth girl that smelled good and wanted to be a nurse would take and hold one of his hands in both of hers to unfreeze him and make him look at her, and she would say that she cannot do it, that she is sorry she did not know this sooner, that she hadn't meant to lie. She agreed because she wanted to believe that she could, but she cannot. That she will carry this and have it, she has to, with her gaze clear and steady. That all night last night she prayed and searched inside herself and decided this is what love commands of her. That Lane should please, sweetie, let her finish. That, listen, this is her own decision and obliges him to nothing. That she knows he does not love her, not that way, has known it all this time, and that it's all right. That it is as it is, and it's all right. She will carry this and have it and love it and make no claim on Lane, except his good wishes and respecting what she has to do. That she releases him all claim and hope he finishes up at PJC and does so good in his life and has all joy and good things. Her voice will be clear and steady, and she will be lying, for Lane had been given to read her heart, to see through her, One of the opposite side's blacks raises his arm in what may be greeting or waving off a bee. There is a mower cutting grass someplace off behind them. It will be a terrible last-ditch gamble born out of the desperation in Sherry Fisher's soul. The knowledge that she can neither do this thing today nor carry a child alone and shame her family. Her values block the way either way. Lane could see, and she has no other options or choice. This lie is not a sin. Galatians 4:16. Have I then become your enemy? She is gambling that he is good. There on the table, neither frozen nor yet moving, Lane Dean Jr. sees all this and is moved with pity, and also with something more, something without any name he knows, that is given to him in the form of a question that never once in all the long weeks' thinking and division had even so much as occurred. Why is he so sure he doesn't love her? Why is one kind of love any different? What if he has no earthly idea what love is? What would even Jesus do? For it was just now he felt her two small, strong, soft hands on his to turn him. What if he was just afraid? If the truth was no more than this, and if what to pray for was not even love, but simple courage to meet both her eyes as she says it and trust his heart. And now, from the March 9th, 2009 edition of the New Yorker magazine, an essay entitled The Unfinished, David Foster Wallace's Struggle to Surpass Infinite Jest by D.T. Max. The writer David Foster Wallace committed suicide on September 12th of last year. His wife, Karen Green, came home to find that he had hanged himself on the patio of their house in Claremont, California. For many months, Wallace had been in a deep depression. The condition had first been diagnosed when he was an undergraduate at Amherst College in the early 80s. Ever since, he had taken medication to manage its symptoms. During this time, he produced 2 long novels, 3 collections of short stories, 2 books of essays and reporting, and, quote, everything and more, in quote, a history of infinity. Depression often figured in his work. In The Depressed Person, a short story about an unhappy, narcissistic young woman included in Wallace's 1999 collection, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, he wrote, quote, Paxil, Zoloft, Prozac, Tofranil, Wellbutrin, Elavil, Metrazole in combination with unilateral ECT during a 2-week voluntary inpatient course of treatment at a regional mood disorders clinic. Parnate both with and without lithium salts. Nardil both with and without Xanax. None had delivered any significant relief from the pain and feelings of emotional isolation that rendered the depressed person's every waking hour an indescribable hell on earth, end quote. He never published a word about his own mental illness. Wallace's death was followed by 4 public memorial services, celebrations of his work in newspapers and magazines, and tributes on the web. He was only 46 when he killed himself, which helped to explain the sense of loss readers and critics felt. There was also Wallace's outsized passion for the printed word at a time when it looked like it needed champions. His novels were overstuffed with facts, humor, digressions, silence, and sadness. He conjured the world in 200-word sentences that mix formal diction and street slang, technicalese, and plain speech. His prose slid forward with a controlled lack of control that mimed thought itself. Quote, what goes on inside is just too fast and huge and all interconnected for words to do more than barely sketch the outlines of at most one tiny little part of it at any given instant, end quote, he wrote in Good Old Neon, a story from 2001. Riffs that did not fit into his narrative he sent to footnotes and endnotes, which he liked, he once said, because they were, quote, almost like having a second voice in your head, end quote. The sadness over Wallace's death was also connected to a feeling that, for all his outpouring of words, he died with his work incomplete. Wallace, at least, never felt that he had hit his target. His goal had been to show readers how to live a fulfilled, meaningful life. Quote, fiction's about what it is to be a effing human being, end quote, he once said. Good writing should help readers to, quote, become less alone inside, end quote. Wallace desired to write, quote, morally passionately moral fiction, end quote, as he put it in a 1996 essay on Dostoevsky, presented him with a number of problems. For one thing, he did not feel comfortable with any of the dominant literary styles. He could not be a realist. The approach was, quote, too familiar and anesthetic, end quote, he once explained. Anything comforting put him on guard. It seems important to find ways of reminding ourselves that most familiarity is mediated and delusive, he said in a long 1991 interview with Larry McCaffrey, an English professor at San Diego State. The default for Wallace would have been irony, the prevailing tone of his generation. But as Wallace saw it, irony could critique, but it couldn't nourish or redeem. He told McCaffrey, look, man, we'd probably most of us agree that these are dark times and stupid ones, but we do need fiction that does nothing but dramatize. But do we need fiction that does nothing but dramatize how dark and stupid everything is? So Wallace's project required him to invent a language and a stance of his own. Quote, I want to author things that both restructure worlds and make living people feel stuff, he wrote to his editor Michael Pitch while he was working on his second novel, Infinite Jest, which Little Brown published in 1996. He knew that such proclamations made him seem a holy fool. In the interview with McCaffrey, he said, it seems like the big distinction between good art and so-so art lies in being willing to sort of die in order to move the reader somehow. Even now, I'm scared about how sappy this will look in print saying this. And the effort to actually to do it, not just to talk about it, requires a kind of courage I don't seem to have yet. He also said, all the attention and engagement and work you need to get from the reader can't be for your benefit. It's got to be for hers. One of the great pleasures in reading Wallace is to watch him struggle to give the reader her due. His first novel, The Broom of the System, published in 1987, tells of a young woman who worries that she might exist only as a character in a story. The book suggests that the world should not be taken too seriously. Life is an intellectual game, and words are the pieces on the board. The problem for Wallace, as he reflected after its publication, was that Broom offered an analysis but derided even the idea of a solution. In a 1989 letter to the novelist Jonathan Franzen, a friend, Wallace said that Broom felt as if it had been written by a very smart 14-year-old. Infinite Jest, which came out almost a decade after Broom, was a vast investigation into America as the land of addictions, to television, to drugs, to loneliness. The book comes to center on a halfway house supervisor named Don Gately, a member of Alcoholics Anonymous who, with great effort, resists these enticements. What's endurable is what his own head could make of it all, Gately thinks near the end. But he could choose not to listen. Though, through the example of Gately, Infinite Jest offered readers an oblique form of counsel. But Wallace had mixed feelings about the book. The critic James Wood cited Infinite Jest as representative of the kind of fiction dedicated to the, quote, pursuit of vitality at all costs, end quote. At times, Wallace felt the same way. Quote, I'm sad and empty, as I always am, when I finish something long, Wallace wrote to Franzen shortly before the book's publication. quote, "I don't think it's very good." Some clipping called a published excerpt feverish and not entirely satisfying, which goes a long way toward describing the experience of writing the thing, end quote. Wallace began to doubt the aspect of his work that many readers admired most, his self-consciously maximalist style. He was known for endlessly fracturing narratives and for stem-winding sentences adorned with footnotes that were themselves stem-winders. Such techniques originally had been his way of reclaiming language from banality, while at the same time representing all the caveats, micro-thoughts, meta-moments, and other flickers of his hyperactive mind. Wallace's approach reminded the reader that what he was reading was invented. The final work of constructing a moral world was his. But after Infinite Jest, Wallace came to feel that his prose was too often arch and arid. Without capitulating to realism, he wanted to tell his stories in a more straightforward way. From 1997 on, Wallace worked on a third novel, which he never finished, The Long Thing, as he referred to it with Michael Peach. His drafts, which his wife found in the garage after his death, amount to several 100,000 words, and tell of a group of employees at an internal revenue service center in Illinois and how they deal with the tediousness of their work. The partial manuscript, which Little Brown plans to publish next year, expands on the virtues of mindfulness and sustained concentration. Properly handled, boredom can be an antidote to our national dependence on entertainment, the book suggests. As Wallace noted at a 2005 commencement speech at Kenyon College, true freedom means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. Because if you cannot exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you will be totally hosed. By then, Wallace had become convinced that the literary contortions for which he was known had become an impediment to his message. Franzen says of Wallace, there was a certain kind of effulgent writing that he just wasn't interested in doing anymore. In the new novel, a character comments, maybe dullness is associated with psychic pain, because something that's dull or opaque fails to provide enough stimulation to distract people from some other, deeper type of pain that is always there, if only in an ambient, low-level way, in which most of us spend nearly all our time and energy trying to distract ourselves from. Wallace was trying to write differently, but the path was not evident to him. I think he didn't want to do the old tricks people expected of him, Karen Green, his wife, said, but he had no idea what the new tricks would be. The problem went beyond technique. The central issue for Wallace remained, as he told McCaffrey, how to give, quote, CPR to those elements of what's human and magical that still live and glow despite the time's darkness. He added, quote, really good fiction could have as dark a worldview as it wished, but it'd find a way both to depict this world and to eliminate the possibilities for being alive and human in it, end quote. In the late 80s, doctors had prescribed Nardil for Wallace's depression. Nardil, an antidepressant developed in the late 50s, is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor that is rarely given for long periods of time because of its side effects, which include low blood pressure and bloating. Nardil can also interact badly with many foods. One day, in the spring of 2007, when Wallace was feeling stymied by the long thing, he ate at a Persian restaurant in Claremont, and afterward he went home ill. A doctor thought that Nardil might be responsible. For some time, Wallace had come to suspect that the drug was also interfering with his creative evolution. He worried that it muted his emotions, blocking the leap he was trying to make as a writer. He thought that removing the scrim of Nardil might help him see a way out of his creative impasse. Of course, as he recognized even then, maybe the drug wasn't the problem. Maybe he simply was distant. Or maybe boredom was too hard a subject. He wondered if the novel was the right medium for what he was trying to say, and worried that he had lost the passion necessary to complete it. That summer, Wallace went off the antidepressant. He hoped to be as drug-free as Don Gately and as calm. Wallace would finish the long thing with a clean brain. He entered this new period of life with what Franzen calls, quote, a sense of optimism and a sense of terrible fear, end quote. He hoped to be a different person and a different writer. That's what created the tension, Franzen recalls, and he didn't make it. David Wallace was born in 1962 in Ithaca, New York. His father, James, was a graduate student in philosophy. When David was 3, his father took a job at the University of Illinois in Urbana. His mother, Sally, was an English teacher. Wallace and his sister, Amy, who was 2 years younger, grew up in a home with language at its center. On a car trip when David was 4, the family agreed to substitute 3.14159 for every mention of the word pie in their conversation. If there was no word for a thing, Sally Wallace invented it. Greebles meant little bits of lint, especially those with feet brought into bed. Twanger was the word for something whose name you don't know or can't remember. Wallace was encouraged and pushed by his parents. This was the kind of family where the mother would bring home the Encyclopedia Britannica for the family to read through, the novelist Mark Costello, who roomed with Wallace at Amherst, says. When Wallace was 12, he was one of 2 winners of a local poetry contest. Did you know that rats breed there? That garbage is their favorite lair? David wrote of a polluted creek nearby. He used the $50 prize to help pay for tennis camp. He was an awkward child, but competitive, and he became a very good tennis player, ranked in the junior Midwest division. One summer, he taught children in the Urbana Parks program. The penalty for botching shots was that Wallace would recount chapters from his life, and they were all made up. His family and teachers realized that David was exceptional. He was just going to hoover everything, his mother said. But he was soon struggling with mental and emotional difficulties. In his senior year of high school, he began carrying a towel around with him to wipe away the perspiration from anxiety attacks, and a tennis racket so that no one commented on the towel. He was purposely hiding the attacks, I think, his father says. He was very ashamed of it. During this time, David applied to Amherst, where his father had gone, and was accepted. Before Wallace left for college, he took a long walk through the cornfields to say goodbye to the Midwest. At Amherst, he was soon drawn to math and philosophy. He relished the special sort of buzz that they provided, as he later told McCaffrey. These moments appeared in proof completions or maybe algorithms, or like a gorgeously simple solution to a problem you suddenly see after half a notebook with gnarly attempted solutions. Wallace joined the debate and glee clubs and smoked a lot of pot with friends. One day, though, toward the end of his sophomore year, Costello walked into their dorm room to find Wallace sitting alone, slumped over his gray Samsonite suitcase between his legs, a Chicago Bears cap on his head. I have to go home, he told Costello. Something's wrong with me. His family was surprised by his return. We didn't press him, his mother says. We figured if he wanted to talk about it, he'd talk about it. For a short time, he drove a school bus. He also found a psychiatrist and began taking antidepressants. During this time, he traced his breakdown to his not really wanting to be a philosopher. I kind of had a midlife crisis at 20, which probably doesn't augur well for my longevity, he later told McCaffrey. He began to write fiction. Until then, Wallace had seen novels primarily as a pleasurable way to get information. Even in later years, he admired the novels of Tom Clancy for their ability to pack in facts. But he realized that fiction could order experience as well as philosophy could, and also provide some of the same comfort. During this time, he wrote several short stories, one of which was published. The Planet Trilithon appeared in the Amherst Review in 1984. The autobiographical story captures the intense pain of the depression he suffered. It reads, "I'm not incredibly glib, but I'll tell what I think the bad thing is like. Imagine that every single atom in every single cell in your body is sick, intolerably sick, and every proton and neutron in every atom swollen and throbbing, off color, sick, with just no chance of throwing up to relieve the feeling. Every electron is sick here, twirling off balance and all erratic in these funhouse orbitals that are just thick and swirling with mottled yellow and purple poison gases, everything off balance and woozy. Quarks and neutrinos out of their mind and bouncing sick all over the place." When he returned to school, Wallace took his first creative writing class and began aggressively reading contemporary fiction. He was drawn to the postmodernists, whose affection for puzzles and mirrors within mirrors sensibility reflected his own enthusiasm for math and philosophy. Costello remembers, "Junior year, David and I were sitting around talking about magical realists. I think it was 100 Years of Solitude. And someone said, 'Pynchon's much cooler.' And we said, 'Who?' And he threw a copy of Lot 49 at us. For Dave, that was like Bob Dylan finding Woody Guthrie." Wallace also loved Don DeLillo's White Noise, which came out when he was a senior. That year, Wallace began his novel, The Broom of the System. A remark from an old girlfriend had stuck in his mind. He later wrote to Gerald Howard, the book's editor, that, quote, "She had said that she would rather be a character in a piece of fiction than a real person. And I got to wondering just what the difference was." Wallace wrote most of the nearly 500 pages of Broom during the second semester. He took his deadpan dialogue from DeLillo and his character names and attitude of paranoia from Pynchon. His protagonist is Lenore Stonecipher Beadsman. Her boyfriend is Rick Vigorous, an Amherst graduate and the director of the publishing firm Frequent and Vigorous. Beadman's great-grandmother, a disciple of Wittgenstein, has mysteriously disappeared from her nursing home. The atmosphere of ontological uncertainty that pervades the book is Wallace's dramatization of the ideas of Wittgenstein. Yet there was a tumble and urgency to his writing that broke free of this philosophical anger. Rick Vigorous thinks about Lenore's great-grandmother as follows. Apparently, she was some sort of phenomenon in college and won a place in graduate study at Cambridge. But in any event, there she studied under a mad crackpot who believed that everything was words. Really. If your car would not start, it was apparently to be understood as a language problem. If you were unable to love, you were lost in language. Being constipated equaled being clogged with linguistic sediment. In September 1985, Wallace mailed a chapter of Broom to a literary agency in San Francisco. In a cover letter, he noted coyly that he was roughly the same age as Bret Easton Ellis and David Levitt, quote, "whose fiction has done well partly because of readers' understandable interest in new young writing," end quote. A new associate at the agency, Bonnie Nadell, loved the chapter and took Wallace on as her first client. 3 months later, she sold the manuscript to Gerald Howard of Penguin Books, which had started a line of contemporary novels in paperback. In a letter to Howard, Wallace explained that Broom wasn't, quote, "realistic, and it is not metafiction. If it's anything, it's meta, the difference between the two," end quote. In the McCaffrey interview, he described Broom as a covert autobiography, quote, "the sensitive tale of a sensitive young wasp who's just had this midlife crisis that's moved him from coldly cerebral analytical math to a coldly cerebral take on fiction, which also shifted his existential dread from a fear that he was just a 98.6 Fahrenheit calculating machine to a fear that he was nothing but a linguistic construct." The editing went smoothly. In a letter to Howard, Wallace had promised to be neurotic and obsessive, but not too intransigent or defensive. But they disagreed on how Broom should end. Howard felt that the text called for some sort of resolution, and Wallace did not think so. Howard urged him to keep in mind, quote, the physics of reading, end quote, or, as Wallace came to understand the phrase, quote, a whole set of readers' values and tolerances and capacities and patience levels to take into account when the gritty business of writing stuff for others to read is undertaken, end quote. In other words, a reader who got through a long novel like Broom deserved a satisfying ending. Wallace was not so confident a writer as to simply ignore Howard's suggestion. As he wrote to Howard, he didn't want his novel to be like Kafka's Investigations of a Dog, Ayn Rand, or late Günter Grass, or Pynchon at its rare worst, books that gave pleasure only to their authors. Yet when he tried to write a proper conclusion, quote, in which geriatrics emerge, revolutionize, things are cleared up, end quote, the words felt wrong to him. Quote, I am young and confused and obsessed with certain problems that I think right now distill the experience of being a human, end quote, he wrote to Howard. Reality was fragmented, and so his book must be too. In the end, he broke the novel off mid-sentence, quote, I am a man of my, end quote. Howard was won over by Wallace's ending. Howard was won over by Wallace's ending and felt that Broom was remarkable, a, quote, portent for the future of American fiction, end quote. He says, it wasn't just a style, but a feeling he was expressing, one of playful exuberance, tinged with a self-consciousness. The dominant style of the time was the minimalism of writers such as Raymond Carver and Ann Beattie, Bret Easton Ellis, and Jay McInerney. Chronicles of Disaffected Youth were an offshoot of this group. These writers were smart, but withholding. Their characters often bored with being bored. Wallace's voice was different. It projected, in Howard's words, quote, the sheer joy of a talent realizing itself, end quote. There was optimism in its despair, elation in its anomie. Broom received varied reviews. Karen James in the Times called the book, quote, a manic, human, flawed extravaganza, end quote, and said that it reminded her of Pynchon's V. But where James saw homage, others saw derivativeness. They thought that Wallace was too eager to show how smart he was. They disliked the lack of an ending. Each negative review surprised and hurt Wallace. After reading a review from Publishers Weekly, Wallace wrote Howard, quote, the guy seemed downright angry at having been made to read the thing, end quote. Yet, Broom found an audience, selling almost 20,000 paperback copies in its first year. Moreover, the book showed other writers that there was a space between taut hermeticism of the mentalists and the postmodern trickery of John Barth and Robert Coover, whose main interest was in uncovering the struts and bolts of narrative fiction. From Broom would come a new strain of meta-the-difference writing. Books such as Dave Eggers' A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius and Zadie Smith's White Teeth. Broom was published while Wallace was in the second year of an MFA program at the University of Arizona. Whereas he had once dressed like a Midwestern square, he now grew his hair long and wrapped his head in a bandana. At Arizona, where realists dominated the faculty, Wallace found himself and his style unpopular. The day after he handed out copies of Broom, he was upset to find one at the second-hand bookstore. All the same, he wrote easily, quickly finishing many of the stories for his first collection, Girl with Curious Hair, published in 1989. The stories were more narrowly postmodern than Broom, concerned with reality and the distorting effects of television and movies. My Appearance was about an actress who was nervous about going on David Letterman's show. Westward, The Course of Empire Takes Its Way was a parodic homage to John Barth's story, Lost in the Funhouse. Wallace came to feel that his professors at Arizona had been right. The stories were brittle and irritatingly clever. But at the time he was happy with them and caught up in the pleasure of artistic creation. Writing fiction takes me out of time, he said in his first interview in Arrival, published when he was in Tucson. That's probably as close to immortal as we'll ever get. In the summer of 1987, Wallace finished his MFA and moved into an apartment on the edge of Tucson. His mood worsened. Curious Hair was largely done, and he did not know what was next. I think he was always afraid that the last thing he wrote would be the last thing he wrote, Amy Wallace, who is now a public defender, says. In late 1987, Wallace took a temporary job teaching creative writing at Amherst. He wrote to Bonnie and Adele that he was drinking a lot and, like Rick Vigorous, wandering around the campus remembering disasters. He returned to Tucson. One day he called home and said he was thinking of hurting himself. His mother flew to Tucson and helped him close up his apartment. They rented a U-Haul and took turns driving and reading aloud a Dean Koontz novel during the 1,600-mile trip home. Back in Urbana, Wallace felt like a failure. A lot of the trouble has to do with writing, but none of it with having stuff to send you, publications or careers, he wrote to Nadell. Nothing to do really with anything exterior to me. In another letter he wrote, my ambitions at this point are modest and mostly surround staying alive. One night he and Amy watched The Karen Carpenter Story, a maudlin TV movie about the singer who died of a heart attack brought on by anorexia. When it was over, Wallace's sister, who was working on her own MFA at the University of Virginia, told David that she had to drive back to Virginia. David asked her not to go. After she went, he tried to commit suicide with pills. He survived and checked himself into a psychiatric ward in Urbana, where he was given a course of electroconvulsive therapy. The experience horrified him, but he thought it helped. Wallace's mother remembers that David emerged as delicate as a child. He would ask, how do you make small talk? His mother remembers. How can you know which frying pan to pick out of the cupboard? Wallace had decided that writing was not worth the risk to his mental health. He applied and was accepted as a graduate student in philosophy at Harvard. Philosophy was the only thing that had meant as much to him as writing. It, too, could trigger epiphanies. Harvard had offered him a scholarship, and academia would give him a more stable life with health insurance. At the time, Mark Costello was beginning a job as a lawyer in Boston. Wallace suggested that they rent an apartment together. In the spring of 1989, they moved into a dilapidated house in Somerville. Boston is fun, Wallace wrote to Nadell in May 1989, inviting her to visit. We'll have laughs, listen to rap, and James Brown. He was rebelling against the expectations that people had of him, drinking heavily and smoking a lot of marijuana. Girl with Curious Hair came out in August 1989 to mixed reviews and little attention. Wallace was heartbroken. He thought he'd written a better book than Broom, and then the publication was this big fat zero, Nadell recalls. And when Wallace began his studies at Harvard that fall, he was immediately disappointed. The students did their professors' laundry and clustered around them, and he thought that was just ridiculous, James Wallace remembers. He was a published author and expected to be treated as an equal. About a year after his breakdown in Tucson, Wallace called Costello from the Psychiatric Services Unit at Harvard, telling him that he had to go to the hospital again. An ambulance took Wallace to McLean, the psychiatric facility in nearby Belmont. There he was prescribed the drug Nardil for the first time. We had a brief, maybe 3-minute audience with a psychopharmacologist, his mother told Rolling Stone. In December, Wallace was released and sent to a halfway house in Brighton, a rundown section of Boston. It is a grim place, and I am grimly resolved to go there, he wrote to Nadell. He became serious about fighting his addictions. He participated in alcohol and narcotic rehabilitation programs. He replaced pot with cigarettes and ultimately with chewing tobacco, which he unsuccessfully tried to quit. Before his collapse, he had written observations in notebooks. He took this up again. Amy Wallace remembers him writing in one with a Care Bears cover. But he found that he had lost his commitment to fiction. He was becoming healthy, but felt adrift. In May 1990, he wrote to Jonathan Franzen, with whom he had recently become friends. Right now, I am a pathetic and very confused young man, a failed writer at 28 who is so jealous, so sickly, searingly envious of you and William Volmont and Mark Lehner and even David F. Levitt and any young man who is right now producing pages with which he can live and even approving them off some base clause of conviction about the enterprise's meaning and end. He added that he considered suicide, quote, a reasonable, if not at this point, a desirable option with respect to the whole wretched problem, end quote. Slowly, normality and a pleasure in writing fiction returned to Wallace. Like all residents of the house, he had a job. One day he was supposed to be editing the house rules, but instead he played hooky, holding up in a Brighton library with Flight of Fear, a teen adventure novel. I found it a ripping good read, he wrote Franzen. He added, I think back with much saliva to times in 1984, 85, 86, 87, when I'd sit down and look up and it would be hours later and there'd be this mess of filled up notebook paper and I was just felt wrung out and well effed and well blessed. He wasn't sure all those filled notebooks had been worth it, though. He now saw himself as having been driven by a, quote, basically vapid urge to be avant-garde and post-structural and linguistically calisthenic. That is why I get very spiny when I think someone's suggesting that this may be my root motive and character because I'm afraid it might be. Well, it sounds like we've run out of time for today's broadcast. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed reading it. Next week, we'll continue with the ending of this story about David Wallace and his life and times. The content of this program is for people who are blind and or print impaired. Today's broadcast and all previous New Yorker readings are available as podcasts at our website, trianglereadingservice.org. If you have any comments or questions, please call 919-832-5138. That's it for today. Come back next time. This is Evan Mercer. So long, everybody.